Good evening, friends, colleagues, students, esteemed guests. What a pleasure it is to see you here on this evening with the dusk about us and the background music. Just the last vestiges of sunset here over Baylor's beautiful campus behind us. If you didn't have a chance to admire that as you came in, now is your last opportunity to do that. My name is Doug Henry, and as Dean of the Honors College, and on behalf of Baylor University, I offer my warm welcome greeting to you all. Since 1994, many of you know, but some won't, through the vision and generosity of the Jackson family and friends, an exceptional series of lectures has been hosted here on our campus, given in memory and gratitude for Laura, for whom this series is named, a young woman dear to her family and friends and the Baylor community, and whose affection for, attachment to, belief in the value of engagement with our world is part of the animating spirit of the lecture series. I encourage you to take a good look in the program, where you will see notes describing her life and her concern for the world and for the people in it, whether neighbors across the street or down the way or in the city center, or to the uttermost parts of the earth, those neighbors who may not be seen, but nonetheless are part of a world and a common life that concerns us all. In consequence, her family and friends, through this lectureship in world issues, recall and honor things that were important to Laura, things as it happens that should be and are indeed important for us all. Following last year's interruption of the lecture series due to COVID, we are abounding in gratitude and delight to reconvene, to be together, enjoying one another's company and learning alongside each other at the hand of yet another superb lecturer to whom you'll be introduced shortly. In the meantime, let me welcome forward Phoebe Watson, who will offer an invocation. Phoebe, come on up, please.
Hi friends, my name is Phoebe Watson. I have the honor of serving as the co-chaplain of Kappa here on campus. My co-chaplain Avery is actually in the program, that's who you'll see. She is currently sick, so I will be filling in for her tonight. And yeah, if y'all would bow your heads. Father, I thank you. I thank you for the ability to gather here today, Lord. In memorial of Laura, Lord, I thank you for the generosity of the Jackson family, that we are able to continue to grow and to learn out of this tragedy, Lord. And I just pray that as we listen to this lecture series, Lord, that our hearts be opened and our ears be quick to listen, and that we continue to grow and learn and figure out how we can better serve this world through you, Lord. I am grateful for this blessing and for the gift of being here, and I thank you for the ability to gather here. It's here that we pray. Amen. Oh, and Morgan's going to come up now.
Hi, everybody. My name is Morgan Howell, and I serve as president this year of Kappa Kappa Gamma, and it is my honor to welcome all of y'all to the 27th Annual Lord Jackson Lecture. Laura was an outstanding and respected member of the Baylor community who gave much of her time to activities and organizations on campus. She was a contributing member of Kappa Kappa Gamma Sorority and Student Foundation. She was loved by all who knew her. It is with joy that we remember Laura this evening. At this time, I would like to recognize some of the very special people who are with us tonight. If you could please stand when your name or group is called. Laura's parents, Dr. Frank and Darba Jackson, and other immediate family members of the Jackson family. Friends of the Jackson family who have traveled from Longview and other places from all out of town to be with us this evening. And finally, all of Laura's Kappa sisters, including our advisor, Tommy Lou Davis, who served as Laura's advisor. Thank you all again for coming. It means so much to the Jackson family to see all of your support. We hope you enjoy this evening.
Morgan and Phoebe, thank you, and thanks as well to your Kappa sisters. It is one of the unique features of an endowed lecture series at Baylor to have this level of sororal support and participation. So I commend you. It's wonderful. It is my great pleasure now to introduce the distinguished scholar who is to bring our lecture this evening. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is a Paul Whitfield Horn Distinguished Professor and Political Science Endowed Chair in Public Policy and Public Law in the Department of Political Science at Texas Tech University. She serves as the Chief Scientist of the Nature Conservancy with over 125 peer-reviewed academic papers and publications to her credit. She's prolific in her work as an atmospheric scientist who studies climate change, and an engaged scholar as well who's concerned with sound public health, public policy, agricultural practice, economic systems, among other areas. Dr. Hayhoe is also a devout Christian whose confidence as a scientist is not in the least threatened, but indeed fully undergirded by her Christian faith. The book of Scripture and the book of nature are in her estimable and time-honored understanding, both written by God, meant for our understanding and delight, and rightly to be embraced without conflict. We live in a world, and this may come up along the way in her talk, if not in our own reflection, we live in a world in which some people of faith, especially, alas, in evangelical Christian circles, question the legitimacy of climate science. We also live in a world in which some people of science, trusting tendentiously in what Freud once called our God Logos, questions the rationality of faith. Dr. Hayhoe stalwartly and admirably holds together both science and her faith, and she draws upon both in what for all of us is an urgent of global concern. She comes now to speak to us on the topic of her new book, Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. And I have to say, as I've said already today, if you can at least bring us hope, even if we don't get all the healing tonight, that would be quite an accomplishment. So Dr. Hayhoe, we are thrilled to have you. Please come.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thank you so much, Dr. and Mrs. Jackson, for hosting this amazing lecture. Laura worked at the Council for World Affairs in San Antonio, and the last talk I gave earlier this week was at the Council of World Affairs in Chicago. So there was that connection before we even knew it. I study an issue that is all about world affairs, but it affects us right here where we live. So that's where I wanted to start. But before I start, I want to ask you some questions. I know that's a little unusual, but here's how we're going to do it. You're going to use your phone. You actually get to use your phone. Isn't that amazing? And don't worry if you don't have a phone. That's totally okay. We can do questions without a phone too. But what I want you to do is I want you to go to pollev.com and either enter my name or just type in /Katharine. Now you have to spell it right. And right means 2 A's like Katharine Hepburn. pollev.com/Katharine, Katharine. If you spell it wrong, you'll end up in the wrong place. And when you go there, you will be asked a question. And no surprise, the students have already gotten to the question. And I'm curious who you are. I want to know, are you a student? Are you faculty and staff? Are you a graduate, an alumni? Are you a community member? Or I put in other because I figured there might be somebody who's other. So who are you? I want you to tell me who you are. Now, if this feels a little bit like an election night, I can see why, because, you know, the faculty and staff started off slow, but they're catching up. Took them a little while to get going. We also have community members and other weighing in, but students so far are dominating because we know that you all were born with a different set of fingers than us older people. All right, it looks like it's starting to stabilize at, we got 3/4 students, 16% faculty and staff, and then other. Excellent. All right, now I'm going to ask you a question. And for you students, you'll be able to get the answer to this right away. But for all the non-students, it might take a little while to cast our memory back. This next question, you have to answer with a word, your own word, but only one word. Not two, just one. Describe what you study or what you studied in one word. One word. Oh, history was first. Very impressive. Chemistry caught up quickly. You can see why it has to be one word, because it's a wordle. Oh, biology is winning the day. We have a lot of people. Biology and theology are the two biggest. You can tell by the size of the words, right? Business is catching up. We've got chemistry here too. I'm sensing there might be a bio class attending. Also a theology class and perhaps a business class. Chemistry is also doing well, but we have a lot of different things here. Wow, communications, anthropology, archaeology, marketing. I have something surprising to tell you. As a climate scientist, I work with someone in every one of your fields. Why is that? It's because the issue I study touches on everything, from our theology to communications and marketing to education, to science, of course, too, to law and business. I work with people in every single field listed here, except the only thing that I can identify, I'm not sure what CSD is, but the only thing I can identify there that I haven't worked with someone in is classics. So Doug, we gotta, I gotta add, we gotta add you both to the list, and then I can work with someone in classics too. All right, now I have one more question that will move us into the topic of the lecture. And this question, you need to pick A, B, C, D, or E, or so on, but you can pick as many as are relevant. Ready? Here in Texas, how many of these events have you personally experienced in Texas? Severe thunderstorm, hail, ice storm, hurricane, flood, severe heat wave, tornado, dust storm, or haboob. If you're from Lubbock, everybody would say yes to that one. Wildfire, something else, and blizzard. Answer all of the ones that you have personally experienced in Texas. So the severe thunderstorm got off to an early lead, but blizzard and ice storm and heat wave are catching up. Just to remind you, were you here last February? Because if you were, answer yes to ice storm, okay? That was officially an ice storm. Blizzard counts too. All right, it looks like severe thunderstorm, no surprise. You get one of those every week during the season, right? Hail, ice, hurricane. Again, you can answer as many as you want here. You don't have to pick one. You can pick as many as you've experienced. All right, not too many hurricanes, so not too many people from Houston, or maybe you just left Houston. That was smart. The blizzard's inching up, the heat wave, the ice storm. All right. Well, let me tell you this. And actually, first of all, let me tell you this. This is how I'm going to collect your questions. So from now on, throughout the whole presentation, anytime you want, you can type in your question. It doesn't have to be one word. It can be a whole sentence. But here's the fun part. You can also look at other people's questions as we go along, and you can upvote the ones you most want me to answer. Because we don't have time to answer 30 questions. We have time to answer 5 or 6. So as we go along, you could put in your question anytime here, and you can look at everybody else's and upvote them. So I look forward to seeing what this looks like at the end. So don't forget that, and don't worry, for those of you who don't have cell phones, we'll take a couple of questions from the audience as well. But there we go. One 5-word reason I should be here. Somebody, this works. 5 words. Can I just give you one word? Education? No. You'll have lots of words when we get there. All right. So why did I ask you about weather? Well, wherever you live, we have hot and cold and wet and dry, and that is just the way the weather is. And if you live in Texas, it looks like this. Here in Texas, we have, this is official and this is certified, We have more billion-dollar weather and climate disasters than any state. Did you know that? We are number one. Yeah. Yeah. Since 1980, Texas has had over 200 billion-dollar weather and climate disasters in our single state, and the whole U.S. has experienced 308. We get floods. We get hurricanes. We get water shortages and droughts. We get record-breaking wildfires, we do. We get rain and flood. This is our football stadium underwater. And in fact, just a little boasting here, a few years ago, Lubbock, Texas, where I live, I'm at Texas Tech, went up head-to-head against Caribou, Maine, Fairbanks, Alaska, and Fargo, North Dakota for the toughest weather city, and we won. But just to put some perspective on this, the same year, there was a competition by a Realtors Association that we also won. It was for the most boring city in America. So, getting back to the weather disasters. We are number one in weather disasters, and they have always happened. There have always been hurricanes, there have always been wildfires, there have always been droughts and heat waves and floods. But what we're seeing is that they are increasing. This is the number of billion-dollar disasters by year since 1980 until this year. And you can see it goes up and down from year to year, right? That's weather. But decade by decade by decade, it is ticking upwards. It used to be across the United States that there were, I think, 82 days on average between billion-dollar events across the whole US, and now there's 18 days in between them. That's pretty crazy. Now, whether an event turns into a disaster depends on a couple of different things. It depends on how many people and how much infrastructure is exposed, because obviously if a hurricane never hits land, is it a disaster? No. So it depends on where it happens, and in Texas we have a lot of people and a lot of infrastructure. It depends on how prepared or vulnerable we are, and of course it depends on the event itself. So here in Texas, we have a lot of exposure. We have a lot of people. We have a lot of very quickly growing cities. We have a lot of very valuable infrastructure, a lot of it located along the Gulf Coast. We have a lot of electricity. We have a lot of things that can be affected. We also know that our vulnerability is increasing. I just want to give you one example from Houston. This is the impermeable surfaces in Houston. So in other words, surfaces where water can't go through, so it pools up and it floods. This is what Houston looked like in 2001, and don't blink, this is what it looked like in 2011. So then along in 2017 came what? Hurricane Harvey. And because of the urbanization, it made the floods 20 times more likely because they had paved the heck out of Harris County. Notice I said heck. No beeping needed. And then there's the how prepared are we issue. Well, it turns out that according to the American Society of Civil Engineers, we need to spend $4.5 trillion to fix up our basic infrastructure. And they gave Texas a scorecard. And you know what our scorecard looks like? You can kind of guess from my face. A C. We got a C for our infrastructure. Our highways get a D+. Our drinking water gets a C-. Our flood risk mitigation gets a C-. Our energy got a B+, but let me be clear with you all. They issued this before the February ice storm. And then we have social vulnerabilities. We know that during the ice storm, people who lived in homes that were not insulated, that had broken windows, that couldn't afford a generator, they suffered the most. Those neighborhoods often got the power turned on the last. I was just on a call today with an African-American scientist who was explaining how when the government doles out relief funds after disaster, low-income neighborhoods get those funds least and last. And so often now, people are still trying to recover from the last storm. They still have the tarps up, and the next storm arrives. There are profound social inequities in how we're affected by disasters as well, right here in Texas, as well as around the world. So we have exposure in Texas, we have vulnerability in Texas, and then let's talk about the weather and climate events. It turns out that they are also increasing. And when you add all these three together, that's when you get even worse disasters. So what do we see happening? We see, I think I'm missing something here. There we go. We see drought surpassing the drought of record. We see floods surpassing the 500-year flood happening multiple times. We see dire warnings in the headlines from people who study this all across Texas. We see that things are getting worse. I just want to give you two specific examples here of how things are getting worse. Well, the world is getting warmer, and that includes the ocean. And oceans power stronger storms. So Hurricane Harvey, we know, was stronger and slower. It had a lot more rainfall associated with it, and we even know that the economic damages were significantly greater because it was supersized by a warmer ocean. There's a direct connection between how warm the ocean is and how damaging a hurricane is. Now, this one's a little counterintuitive. How did we have a worse ice storm in a warmer world? That doesn't make sense. That's why I call what we see global weirding rather than global warming. Because let me explain to you here. And it took scientists, just so you feel, you understand, it took scientists from February to September to figure this out. I'm going to try to explain it to you in 30 seconds. But this will be of necessity a simplified explanation. So the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. Because as the shiny white ice melts, it exposes dark water underneath that absorbs a lot more of the sun's energy. As the Arctic warms, it disrupts the polar vortex. We've all heard about that these days. The polar vortex starts to stretch, which causes the jet stream to start to wave like this. And as that jet stream dips down, it's like opening the freezer door and all the cold air in the Arctic pouring all the way down to where? To Texas. So there's even a connection between a warmer Arctic and an increased risk of these events, which we have had before. We've had these freeze events before. We had a really bad one 10 years ago. But it's even connected to a warmer world. What's happening is, wherever we live, we already have a pair of dice, and we always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally. That's just a normal part of life on this planet. But as the world warms, decade by decade, it's as if it's sneaking in and taking one number and then another and turning them into sixes, and then taking another and turning it into a 7. So all of a sudden, we're rolling double six after double six, and then a double 7, and we're like, how did this happen? That's how a warmer world is loading the weather dice against us. So now let's look at the United States. What do we see for the whole US? We looked at Texas. Is this happening across the US? Yes, it is. Across the US, we see that the billion-dollar weather and climate disasters are on their way up. What do the headlines look like across the US? In some places, they look similar. A warmer planet made the North American heat wave this summer 150 times more likely. In some places, they look a little different. Out west, apocalyptic orange skies. How are wildfires made worse by a warmer world? Most wildfires in the western US are the result of accidental human ignition. Only 7% are arson. Most of them are gender reveal fireworks, or somebody dumping a load of burning trash into the dry brush, or power lines sparking, or somebody leaving an appliance plugged into their shed that shorts out and burns down the shed and starts a fire. These are all real-life examples. How does a warmer planet affect those? It doesn't. So where does this come in? Well, imagine that you accidentally drop a match on a pile of green, wet wood. What happens? Not much. Smokes a bit. Then imagine you drop that match on a pile of bone-dry wood that's been sitting out in the heat for days. That's the difference. As the world warms, it's drying out the soil, it's drying out the vegetation, and so when the fire starts, it burns a greater area. And that's exactly what we're seeing. This is a pretty shocking figure showing the area burned by the 20 biggest wildfires only through 2020. And believe me, it's going to look different after this year because they had some big ones this year. They had one even bigger than the biggest pie this year. So from 1932 to 1999, which is when they first started keeping record, 32, they only had 3 of the biggest. Then from 2000 through 2019, they had all those blue ones. And then 2020 alone, they had those red ones. And now after this year, I think the gray is going to be almost gone. So this is how we see the dice are getting loaded against us. And it isn't only happening in the continental US. It's happening in Alaska. It's happening in Canada. If you think back to just before the pandemic, the biggest global headline before the pandemic was in Australia. What's happening? I don't have the same exact figure at the global scale, but this figure actually shows the same thing, just collected by decade. If you look on the left-hand side, it's the economic losses in US billions of dollars due to drought, extreme temperature, flood, landslide, storm, and wildfire. And you can see they are ticking up and up. Some of that is because we have more people. Some of that is because we have more infrastructure. But even when you account for those, there's still an extra on top because the weather and climate disasters are getting bigger and stronger, and in some cases, more frequent. Just before COVID, again, the biggest headline was the Australian Bushfires. What other headlines do we see around the world? Madagascar is confronting its worst drought in decades, and it has a fingerprint on that drought of a warmer world. The heat wave that we saw this past summer when it was 118 degrees in Portland, it was devastating in Canada. There was a small town called Lytton that broke the high temperature record for Canada 1, 2, 3 days in a row, and then on the 4th day, a wildfire burned down most of the town. Whether it's floods in China or floods in Bangladesh, now the monsoon in Bangladesh is normal and natural. But it is not normal and natural for a third of the entire country to be underwater during the monsoon. The question is not, did a warmer planet cause the event? Because of course it didn't. We've always had hurricanes and droughts and wildfires, always. The question is, did it make it worse? And today the answer to that is yes. Now, this is a really interesting field of research that's at the cutting edge of climate science. So if you want to know more about how scientists can put numbers on exactly how much it's making it worse and even dollar signs, I want to recommend a different book to you, not mine. It's a book by one of my colleagues. Her name is Ferdy Otto, and it's a fantastic book called Angry Weather. So if you're interested in knowing more about it, Angry Weather is a really fantastic book to explain how we can actually put numbers on how much worse these things are getting. And this is cutting edge science. But don't be afraid of the book. It's very easy to read. But I want to talk, though, now about a few other questions, starting with, why is the world getting warmer? Because we know that the world has been warmer before. It's been cooler before. We know that energy from the sun and natural cycles and volcanic eruptions all affect our Earth's climate. So why is the world getting warmer? Now, this is what we climate scientists do. We look at all of the natural factors that cause climate to change, and in fact, the reason we know that they exist is because we're the ones who study them. And so when we see the world warming, we don't automatically assume it has to be humans. That would be like as if you're running kind of a low-grade fever and you go to the doctor and the doctor takes one look at you and screams Ebola and runs out of the room and returns with a hazmat team and bundles you into a hazmat suit and takes you out. That'd be ridiculous. Someone goes in with a low-grade fever, you run all the normal tests first. You don't automatically assume it's the most exotic thing. So that's what we did. We ran all the tests. Could it be the sun? No, it turns out the sun's energy has been going down the last 50 years, not up. We should be getting a little cooler, but instead we're getting warmer faster and faster. It is not the sun. Could it be a natural cycle? Natural cycles only move heat around the Earth system, from east to west, north to south, ocean to atmosphere, and back again. So if we get warm due to a natural cycle, it's because the heat is coming from somewhere else. A natural cycle, for example, was something called the medieval warm period. Back in the 12 and 1300s, there was a period when the North Atlantic was warm and Vikings sailed all the way to Newfoundland and Canada. And there's actually, remains of villages that you can visit there. So scientists have created a temperature map of what it looked like back then. And you might say, how did they do that? Using natural thermometers, using tree rings, ice cores, sediment records, you can create a record of what temperature looked like. And when you look at it, you realize that this was a classic natural cycle. Because over the North Atlantic, you see it's warmer. Those are the warm colors, the medieval warm period. But where was that heat coming from? Well, if you lived in Siberia, it was the medieval cold period. So now, on the same scale, let's look at today. Exact same scale, not a natural cycle. Then people say, well, isn't it getting warmer since the last ice age? When a squirrel chased a nut and broke off a piece of ice, and then you've seen the movie. And if you haven't, just wait. Well, according to ice age cycles, we should actually, eventually, in a few thousand years, we should be heading into another ice age, not coming out of it. Warming after the last ice age peaked about 6,000 years ago, which was right when our civilization and agriculture began. Could it be big volcanic eruptions causing the planet to warm? Well, first of all, they would be occurring invisibly, because where are they? But second of all, actually, a big volcanic eruption produces particles that go all the way up to the upper atmosphere that reflect the sun's energy back to space like an umbrella. A big volcanic eruption cools the Earth down for anywhere from a couple of weeks up to 2 years. So it couldn't be a volcanic eruption. We'd be getting cooler, not warmer. That's when we say, all right, could it be something else? And I have a little series on YouTube called Global Weirding, and I have a number of videos, including one that explains what I just went through. This is just part of a natural cycle, isn't it? So we say, could it be something else? And when we turn to what else could it be, the answer is right in front of our faces. Our planet has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases. The sun's energy shines right through that blanket like a window, and the Earth absorbs that heat energy and gives it off. But just like a blanket keeps you warm at night, this natural blanket of heat-trapping gases keeps the planet 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than it would be otherwise. If we did not have this natural blanket, our planet would be a frozen ball of ice. So if this natural blanket is good, which it is, if it's natural, which it is, then what's the problem? The problem is that by digging up and burning increasing amounts of coal and oil and natural gas, we are producing extra heat-trapping gases that our planet was never designed to have. And those extra heat-trapping gases are building up in the planet, wrapping an extra blanket around it. As if you were asleep at night with the perfect blanket and somebody snuck into your room and put an extra heavy blanket on top of you, what would you do? You'd wake up sweating. You'd say, who did this? I didn't need this. That's why our planet is running a fever. Now, you may say, okay, that sounds very simple and plausible, but didn't you just discover this recently? How are you sure? No, we discovered the natural blanket in 1820. We discovered that humans burning coal were wrapping an extra blanket around the planet in the 1850s. We calculated exactly how much warmer the planet would get if we doubled or tripled levels of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere in the 1890s. And by 1930, the planet was warming so much that they could actually measure it from weather stations. Doesn't that just kind of blow your mind? So that's why scientists are sure, is because we have been checking this thing for 200 years. And then in the 1950s, scientists started to use computer models to study it. Two physicists just won the Nobel Prize in Physics a week and a half ago for their work studying climate in the 1950s. And by 1965, scientists were so worried about the potential impacts of this warming on human civilization that they took the unprecedented step of warning a US president about the risks. And that president was Lyndon B. Johnson. 1965. So that leads us to the question, well, so why does this matter? Why does this matter then? Why did scientists warn a US president in 1965 about this issue? It's because climate change is, as the US military calls it, this comes from the Department of Defense, It is a threat multiplier. In other words, it takes the risks we already face today. It doesn't invent new ones. It takes the ones we already face and make them worse. I was asked the other day, okay, so threats to, we think of, global warming, the polar bear, ice sheets. How do you talk about polar bears in Texas, someone said. And I said, you don't. I mean, unless you are a polar bear. What do you talk about in Texas? Talk about cotton. I'm holding a cotton flower there in case you haven't seen one before with one of our local farmers. You talk about water and drought. You talk about your home being underwater if you live in Houston. You talk about our health and our air quality. We care about this because it affects things that matter to every single one of us. Our water, our food, our security, our economy, our health. All too often people think, if you care about climate change, it must be because you're a certain type of person. And typically what we think of is, we are either a polar bear, or we're an environmentalist, or a Democrat, but not always. Not all Democrats care. This is the stereotype. I'm being clear, this is a stereotype we have. And if we're not any of those things, then we think it doesn't matter. It's just something those people care about. Well, as you can see from here, do you care about water at all? I have news for you. If you don't have enough water, you will die. Do you care about food? Do you care about having a safe home? Do you care about having a healthy economy? Do you care about having good health? If you care about any of those things, you already have every reason you need to care. And if you do an inventory of yourself, you can find more reasons. And I talk in the book about how we can do inventories of ourselves. Why do I care? I care because, yes, I am a scientist. I am a Canadian who lives in Texas. I love to ski, which requires snow. Okay, I know you can do it down sand dunes, but it is not the same. And if you fall, it is definitely not the same. But why do I really care? It's because of what is closest to my heart. I'm a mom. I would do anything for a better future for my child. And most profoundly of all, the reason I am actually a climate scientist, literally, is because I'm a Christian. I was planning to be an astrophysicist. And in fact, that's what my undergraduate degree is in. But when I learned that climate change is not only an environmental issue, when I learned that it is a health issue, it is an economic issue, it is a justice issue, it is a poverty issue. When I learned that climate change affects the poorest and most marginalized people in the world, that's when I knew that I, as a Christian, had to do everything I could to help. So whoever you are already the perfect person to care. And if you don't think you do, it is simply because you have not connected the dots between something you already care about passionately and how it is being affected today. To dig just a little bit deeper into us as Christians, we read in Genesis how we were made in God's image for a reason. To rada, every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. Now, rada is translated in different ways, but following the manuscript study approach, rather than give you the word in English, I'm going to show you this word used elsewhere in the Old Testament. Some people interpret it as dominion, but not domination, authority, rule, or responsibility. But if you go to Psalm 72, it's very interesting. It says, may he, also speaking of God, rada from sea to sea, to what? What is the purpose? To extract all the resources from? No, to deliver the needy, the afflicted, and him who has no helper, to have compassion on the poor and the needy, and the lives of the needy he will save. That is what rada refers to. So we often think of creation care or stewardship as taking care of land, animals, plants, which it is. And what would we think of somebody who was entrusted with a piece of property by someone they loved and told to take care of it, to rada it, and they took every penny of value from it and left it a crumbling ruin? What would we think of that person? Not much. Whereas if they had the property and they invested in it so that there were healthy soils, it grew food, it supported people, it had forests to support natural ecosystems, it provided shelter for people, you're investing, you're caring for, you are rada over that land. But it isn't just about land, because often we see ourselves as separate, but we aren't. Are we not living things too? We are. We have responsibility over our brothers and our sisters, not only plants and animals. And today, when we look at climate change impacts, we see that they disproportionately affect people who are already marginalized, who are already disadvantaged, who are already suffering, who already live below the poverty line, who already have unequal rights and unequal access. Whether it is brown and black communities right here in Texas, whether it's indigenous peoples who have already lost so much around the world, whether it's women and children in poor countries, they are disproportionately impacted by all of these changes that we're seeing. It's not just that, it's also air pollution. So air pollution from fossil fuels, get this number, is responsible for almost 9 million premature deaths per year. 9 million premature deaths per year from air pollution alone from burning fossil fuels. And guess what? It's making COVID worse too. People whose lungs are already exposed to air pollution who live in low-income neighborhoods, like in Houston or Chicago, which tend to be, again, brown and black neighborhoods, they are more vulnerable when they're exposed to COVID, and so they think that a big part of the link between the racial inequities and COVID illness and death is due to air pollution from burning fossil fuels. It's all connected. When you look at where people live in poverty around the whole world, the darker the color, the more people live in poverty, and then you compare this to where people are most vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate, what do you see? It's the same places, the same people. Climate change is a threat multiplier. For a poor shareholder in Malawi, who, as drought increases, cannot afford to feed his family anymore. Along comes someone and says, I'll marry your daughter. He says, well, she's only 9 years old. They say, it's okay, we'll double the price. Child marriages in Malawi, which were going down ever since they actually made it illegal to marry below the age of 18 in Malawi, child marriages were going down until when? Until drought started to hit the country, and now they're going back up. And when you talk to people on the ground in Malawi, they say, well, the only guess we have for why they're going back up is because people are so desperate, and the reason they're so desperate is because they can't farm their crops anymore. And the reason they can't farm their crops is because rainfall patterns are shifting. It's dry when it's supposed to be raining, and then you get a month's worth of rain in a single day, and it floods everything out. There are direct connections to human suffering in every single country around the world. And we know that the economic gap between the richest and poorest has already increased by 25%. It's already increased due to the impacts of a warmer world. As the United Nations said before COVID, climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of development, global health, and poverty reduction. But you know what? COVID does too. We've got both of these crises pushing hundreds of millions more people into poverty today. So for me, it's not only about care for creation as if creation is somehow separate from humans. We are embedded in creation, and we are part of creation. We are created beings ourselves. And we are to be recognized by our love for others. That's what Jesus says about his disciples, that we are to be recognized by one thing, which is our love for others. And when I think about the impacts of climate change, and when I think about climate action, what I see underneath it is love. Caring for others, having compassion on others, considering their needs with and above our own, the needs of people right here in Texas as well as on the other side of the world, this is what motivates me to act. I care about a changing climate because I believe the Bible says that God made us responsible for every living thing. I care about it because as a scientist, I know that it takes the risks we face today of hunger, poverty, injustice, inequity, national security, and political stability risks, and I'm quoting the Department of Defense here, and it exacerbates them or makes them worse. But I care also most of all because it's so profoundly unfair and it affects the poorest and most vulnerable, the very ones who have done the least to contribute to the problem. So this is the problem, but what do we do about it? And don't forget, you can put your questions in at any time, polev.com/Catherine, And you can check out other people's questions and upvote them. We're getting near the end now, so if you want to do some upvoting, next 8 minutes is the time. But onward. What can we do about this? Well, I want to talk first of all about the global solutions, and then I want to bring it right back to Texas and to us. So let's start globally. What are the solutions? They aren't a mystery. We know what we need to do. We need to stop putting so much heat-trapping gases into the atmosphere. We need to take it out of the atmosphere, and we need to build resilience to the changes that are already happening today. It's too late to avoid those. What does stopping putting carbon into the atmosphere look like? It looks like efficiency, clean energy, geothermal energy, solar, wind that we have so much of here in Texas. What does it look like to take carbon out of the atmosphere? Smart farming, regenerative agriculture, like we're doing a lot of actually in West Texas. Also conservation, restoring forests and ecosystems, coastal systems, wetlands, mangroves. We could take up to 1/3 of the carbon out of the atmosphere that we produce through investing in restoring nature, which would clean up our air, clean up our water, and oh, by the way, it would take up carbon too. Oh, and it would also reduce the risk of zoonosis. It's a win-win-win. What about building resilience? How about greening some of the low-income neighborhoods that have been redlined over the past century? Racist insurance and mortgage practices that left low-income neighborhoods with all concrete, no parks, no green spaces, no yards, no trees. When a heat wave comes, a low-income neighborhood can be 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than a wealthier neighborhood. And so projects to put trees and green spaces in those areas improve air quality, improve mental health too, improve flood risk and flood control. Oh, and they also take up carbon. It's another win-win-win. Around the world, they're doing amazing things. An innovative smartphone app to improve rainwater harvesting in Africa, or flush toilets in India where many people don't have access to sanitation, and they collect the human waste and they turn it into biogas. Isn't that amazing? Here's a few statistics that really stood out to me. I'm a numbers person. There's some numbers I really like. Did you know that in the United States, now I'm zooming into the US, we waste over 67% of the energy and 40% of the food we produce. We waste it. Through efficiency alone, we could cut our carbon emissions in half and we could save money too. Did you know that if we converted 80% of the US power grid to clean energy, all kinds of clean energy, plus storage too, because I don't know if you know this, but the sun doesn't shine at night. I literally have people saying that to me, and I'm like, yes, degree in astronomy, I know that. And the US would avoid $1.7 trillion in health and other damages. What about jobs? Did you know that solar and wind energy technicians have been the fastest growing jobs in the US for the last 5 years? Clean energy in the US already employs more people than the fossil fuel industry. Did you know that? New solar electricity creates 1.5 times more jobs than new electricity from fossil fuels today. Efficiency programs like retrofitting buildings creates 3 times more jobs than using more energy. And nature-based solutions, smart agriculture, conservation, restoring wetlands, create 4 times more jobs. That's pretty amazing. Then people say, okay, but what about low-income countries? Well, one of the reasons why low-income countries are low-income is because they don't have the fossil fuel resources that we have been blessed with. And I use that word deliberately. I don't know about you, but I never wanted to be a woman living in the 1800s, or heaven forbid the 1700s. The average life expectancy before the Industrial Revolution in the most highly developed country in the world at that time, the UK, was 40 years. I would have been dead, statistically speaking. Fossil fuels have brought us tremendous benefits, and developing countries need energy too. But today, they can get energy in a way that doesn't require them to be indebted to the rich countries who would have to sell it to them. And last year around the world, 90% of new energy was clean energy, already last year. It already happened. So I want to end with this. I want to bring it right down here. What can I do? What can we do in Texas? I did a TED Talk 2 years ago. I was talking about it over dinner. Did you know you have to memorize every word of a TED Talk? It is horrific. Thank goodness I had Sunday school where I would, Sunday school offers prizes for memorizing Bible verses. So I used to be really good. So I had to bring out those skills from my grade 7 Sunday school class to memorize this TED Talk. They asked me, what's the most important thing you can do, you as an individual? And I said, well, I've looked at changing light bulbs. I've looked at electric cars. I've looked at solar panels. And even if all of us did it, it would be this much of the solution. The most important thing we can do is something that we're not doing. We are not talking about it. We don't talk about it. And if we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever do anything about it? And you might say, talking? I don't want to get in an argument, and I'm not a scientist. That's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about you, not me. And this is actual science. There is science studying this. You, not me, are the best person to talk about it. What do I mean by that? You talking about it to people you know, people you go to school with, people in your class, people in your dorm, people you work with, people you go to church with, people in your neighborhood, people on your sports team. You are the best person to have that conversation, to talk, not about the facts or to have an argument. No, if it's an argument, just leave. I have never seen a positive outcome from a big argument. Talk about why it matters to you. And in my book, because this was not my book, in my book, I talk about how you can have a conversation about why it matters if you play tennis, if you run, if you play golf, if you ski, if you hunt, if you fish, if you love cooking, or beer, or wine. I'm allowed to say that, right? Okay. Just checking. You can have a conversation if you live in Texas, if you live in Missouri, if you live in Portland, if you live in New York. You can have a conversation about how you're a Christian and what you believe. There are a million points of connection. I have even started conversations over a shared love of knitting. I do knit, and I do love knitting. Whatever you connect with on somebody else, you can connect to how this is affecting us and this is the second best part, all of the positive things that we can do to fix it. I already showed you some of those at the global scale and the national scale, but let's talk about what's happening here in Texas. We have more wind energy than any other state. 23% of our electricity last year came from wind and sun. When I moved to Texas 15 years ago, we weren't even on the top list of 10 solar producing states. We are number 2 right now. They're building the biggest solar farm in the US outside of Dallas, and we are going to be number 1 in a year. That's pretty amazing. We have the biggest army base in the US, Fort Hood, right, down by Killeen, and they are currently 43% powered by clean energy because they're going to save taxpayers $150 million. That's how much cheaper it was than natural gas. We have entire towns going green, like Georgetown, Texas. The city of Dallas has been powered by clean energy for, I think, 3 years now. The DFW airport is the first carbon-neutral airport in North America. The city of Houston has a massive climate plan that includes accounting for how flooding is increasing. I mean, the stories in Texas, I could go on and on. A bunch of 6th graders from Lubbock, Texas won a National Army Science competition last year for a program called Carbon Stewards on how you can put carbon back in the soil through smart farming practices that actually fertilizes your crops. We are doing an amazing job here in Texas and nobody knows it. That's something that we can talk to people about. It's pretty encouraging, right? I bet you didn't think I was going there. I really enjoy talking about what's happening in industry. I was talking to a woman the other day who worked in Walmart, and I said, did you know that Walmart's going to be powering half of all of its energy from clean sources within 4 years? And she said, no, I had no idea. And I said, how does that make you feel about the place where you work? And she said, great. And that's something she can tell people now. I love, there's many other companies, Microsoft, Apple. You can go on and on with the companies who are doing amazing things today. I love talking about what's happening in churches, what's happening in mission organizations. Tony Renato here is with World Vision. You've probably heard of World Vision, right? I have 2 kids with World Vision, and you might have too. Tony realized that in sub-Saharan Africa, one of the poorest places in the planet, they couldn't afford to grow enough food to feed people there. So he is an agronomist, which means he studies agriculture and soils. And he realized that if they would plant trees inside and along the edges of their fields, the trees would conserve the nutrients in the soil and trap the water that would enable them to grow more crops. And through Tony's patient work, working with people across sub-Saharan Africa as part of World Vision, he has enabled farmers in that very poor region to grow enough more food to feed 2.5 million more people. One man did that. And you know what? It's making it more resilient to the changes in rainfall patterns, and the trees take up carbon too. It's a win-win-win. There's really funny stories when you look for them, like the Kentucky Coal Museum going solar. Or did you know that United Airlines has been flying biofuel flights out of the LA airport for 5 years? Nobody knew that. But Google has a new flight tool where when you go to Google Flights to get your ticket, it shows you the carbon footprint of your flight. And now United Airlines is going to be able to put a carbon footprint that is massively lower than everybody else's. They're going to be able to show off finally. I hope they do. I'm going to check, and if they don't, I'm going to send them an email. You are missing an opportunity here. You need to show off and show people. Because biofuels cut emissions by 80%. Same engine, absolutely same engine, no change. I love telling stories about what's happening around the world, whether it's 17-year-olds here in the US building algae biofuel labs originally under her bed until her mom kicked her out into the garage, and winning science fairs, or whether it's solar energy transforming the lives of women in sub-Saharan Africa. There's an awesome organization called Project Drawdown that you can find online, drawdown.org, and they list 100 solutions. 100 solutions. And sure, they've got solar and they've got wind, but they've also got coastal wetland protection, conservation agriculture, efficient shipping, efficient aviation, efficient trucks, education of women and girls in poor countries. They've got all kinds of solutions that you're like, duh, why not do those? Oh, and if they help with climate change too, that's a bonus. There's so many things that we could be doing, but the biggest thing that each of us individually lacks is efficacy. We feel like this giant boulder is sitting at the bottom of a hill with only a few hands trying to push it up, and it's never going to move. But when we start to look at all the stories of what's happening here in Texas, what's happening in the church around the world, I'm about to go to Glasgow to the big climate meeting, and there is a lot of Christians going there, a lot, to talk about what's happening and what they're doing. When we realize everything that's going on, we realize that boulder is already rolling down the hill in the right direction. Okay, I know this is fake, she's not really pushing the boulder. But you get my point, right? And not only is there one set of hands, there's millions of sets of hands on that boulder. And if we add our hand too, it will go a little bit faster. Each of us is able to make a difference, but how does that begin? With using our voice. Because, and this is what I want to end with, this is not from the book. This is from an essay I wrote for Time magazine after the book. But in it, I elaborated on how does an individual make a change. Change in the past, it didn't begin with the King of England deciding to end slavery. He just didn't wake up one morning and said, I'm going to abolish slavery. It didn't begin with the President of the US deciding to just randomly give women the vote one day, out of the goodness of his heart. It didn't end when the National Party of South Africa just woke up one day and decided we'll end apartheid. When did change begin? It began when very ordinary people of no particular power or wealth or fame, decided that the world could and should be different. Who were William Wilberforce, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela? And who were all the countless others whose names we don't even know, who shared and supported and fought for their visions of a better world? They were not rich, they were not famous, they were not influential or powerful, but they were people who had the courage of their convictions, who used their voices to advocate for the systemic societal changes needed. They were the very ones who Jesus sent out in the world, a bunch of poor, uneducated fishermen to change the world. Anybody looking at that plan would have said, that is ridiculous, yet somehow it worked, didn't it? And it has worked again and again when people of faith have raised their voices based on what they know in their hearts to be true and who God has made them, to say, we are the people who have changed the world before, and we are the people who can change it again. God has not given us a spirit of fear. He has given us a spirit of power to act, not be paralyzed. He has given us a spirit of love to have compassion on others. And he has given us a sound mind to make good decisions based on the information in part that science gives us. So when I think about climate change, it is not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we are gone. It is literally about saving us. We and our economy cannot float around in outer space without the resources this planet provides. If we do not fix this problem, the planet will still be here, but our economy will not. And our civilization may not either. So that is why when I wrote my book, I literally called it Saving Us. Thank you. So now we get the fun part of the questions, right? But before we go to the poll questions, which I have here on my phone and you'll have too, do we have anybody who wanted to ask one in person who didn't have a phone with them that they could use? I'll give you one more chance afterwards, so don't worry if you don't have one now. Okay, 32 votes for the top question. Good job. What are the biggest changes you've made in your personal life to be more environmentally conscious, and what are the most impactful steps that we can take in our personal lives? So my answer might have surprised you before the end of the talk, but I don't think it's going to surprise you now. When we make, let me explain it a different way though. When we make personal choices that affect our personal life, and that is the only thing we do, we are changing the size of our personal footprint. When we use our voice to talk about the changes we've made ourselves, the changes schools can make, churches can make, states, businesses, nonprofits, corporations, sports teams, clubs, when we use our voice to advocate for change in the greater circles that we are part of, and we are all part of larger circles than ourselves, we influence people in the area of our shadow. And picture yourself standing in front of the setting sun. How big is your footprint? How big is your shadow? So the most important thing that we can do is to use our voice to talk about this. We can do it on social media, not arguing with people. If they're going to argue, just, nope, I don't. We can share, again, why it matters and what are things that people are doing to fix it. We can use our voice to talk about it. We can ask people questions and look for connections on how this relates to them. Using our voice is one of the most important things we can do. There's organizations that amplify this, like Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. I don't know if you've heard of them. A couple of you must have. Over 20,000 young evangelicals around the United States who are all unified in using their voice to call for action at the state level and at the national level. There's organizations for Catholics. There's organizations for skiers. There's organizations for moms. I'm part of one called Science Moms. There's organizations for almost anyone that help us to amplify our voice. So the single most important thing we can do is what we're not doing. Only 14% of us are talking about climate change. The second most important thing we can do is join an organization that helps amplify your voice, or sometimes even start one, like a green team at your church. And the third most important thing we can do is use our voice again as much as possible. But now you might say, okay, so she's saying you don't have to do anything. No, what did I say I talk about? I talk about why it matters, and I talk about what I do and what others do. So every year I adopt 2 new habits. I do two every year. And one year I actually had my 2, and then my husband surprised us with solar panels for Christmas. I traded up my hybrid for an EV plug-in when it was the time. I got rid of the freezer and started grocery shopping every 2 times a week to reduce food waste and to eat more fresh plants and seafood and less red meat, which has a bigger carbon footprint. I took away the freezer and put drying racks in so I could hang up my clothes. That was part of that year. Of course, I did change all the light bulbs, which saved a lot of money. If you change an LED today, compared to if somebody gave you a free incandescent bulb, you'll be saving money in Texas after 4 months. That's how crazy it is. I know if you live in the residence, it's not your problem yet, but it will be your problem. So every year I do 2 things, but what do you think I do? I talk about it. I post about it on Instagram. I share it with other people. I talk about in my book how when I first got my plug-in car, I had it plugged in outside because we didn't have a plug in the garage. All of our neighbors who used to do the Texas thing where you drive by and you wave like this without rolling down the window, right? Every single neighbor stopped. And if they saw we were outside, they got out of the car and they're like, what is that? We said it's a plug-in car, and they're like, does it have a steering wheel? Yeah, it does. Does it have a gas pedal? Yeah, it actually does. Where did you get it? How much did it cost? You know, how long does the battery last? And it was great because we could talk about it. But I also talk about what schools do. I talk about what Texas is doing. I talk about what businesses are doing. Because what does that do? It shows us that there are 1 million hands rolling that boulder down the hill, and the more hands we have, the faster it goes. So that is the number one thing we can all do. And yes, do something in your own life and then talk about it. Share with people why you do it, why you love it, how good it is, why it works for you. And don't guilt or shame them into doing the same. Just share your joy and your enthusiasm and communicate. Bottom line, love. All right. Why do so many people push back against climate change and are so skeptical of it? This is a whole different talk. And in fact, I've given quite a few talks on exactly this subject. It's also in the book, but I'll give you the short answer. And you can find more talks I've given online that get into this. How old is climate science? 200 years, right? 1800s. How old is skepticism and science denial? 20 years. How do I know? Because Gallup started polling Americans in the 1990s, asking them what they thought about this issue. And all through the 1990s, Republicans and Democrats said the same things, thought the same things about it. Until when? Until it became obvious that the impacts were already here and we had to do something about it. It became no longer a future issue, it became an issue we had to do something about. And then the denial machine swung into action, and the largest corporations in the world, 90 companies, are responsible for 2/3 of all heat-trapping gas emissions since the dawn of the industrial era. 20 companies are responsible for 1/3 of the problem since the 1960s. Those companies are primarily the coal, the oil, and the gas companies of the world. Not all of them. They range across a very broad spectrum, from good actors to bad actors. But a number of them decided to choose the bad actor end of the spectrum. And so they decided it was cheaper to invest in muddying the waters and sowing doubt, even though their own scientists had studied this in the 1970s and come to the exact same conclusions as every other scientist. They had scientists inside their organizations, yet they decided to hire the people who the tobacco industry had just recently had to let go, who were muddying the waters on smoking and the connection to lung cancer. They hired those people to muddy the waters, to sow disinformation, to plant myths like it's volcanoes, or it's the sun, or natural cycles, to say God's in control so it doesn't matter what humans do, when Genesis 1:1 says God gave humans responsibility over every living thing on this earth. There's a really, really interesting movie and book called Merchants of Doubt, if you're interested in knowing more about this. Yeah, a few people are nodding. Merchants of Doubt. Watch it this weekend. I think it's on Netflix. And they were so successful in not only doing this, but attacking climate scientists. And I speak from personal experience. I have been attacked. I have been threatened with lawsuits if I wouldn't shut up. They were so successful that now, in the United States, a large number of people are still convinced that it isn't real. But growing numbers, and today we've reached 70%. 70% of us are worried. 70% of us in the US are worried about this. When you ask younger people under the age of 25, it goes up to 84%. When you ask mothers, it's 83%. Most of us are worried about this, but we don't understand how it matters to us here and now. We think it's about the polar bear instead of about us. And we don't know what to do to fix it. We think that giant boulder is sitting at the bottom of the hill with only a few hands on it, and even if I add my hand, it's not going to move, so why bother? So that's why when we talk about it, it's so important to talk about what? About why it matters to us here and now in ways that are relevant to us, and to talk about what real solutions really look like and how they are good for the economy, they are good for the US, and they are even good for Texas. And if they're good for Texas, they're pretty much good for everybody, right? Has my knowledge in science ever made me doubt my faith? As Absolutely not, because I grew up with the idea, which is going to seem really simple when I say it, but it's a little bit of a novel idea for many, that if God, the same God who inspired the Bible, created the universe, how could the two things be in conflict with each other? How could studying the Bible be in conflict with studying God's creation? Now, I'm not naive. I know that they're often perceived to be in conflict. But where does the fault lie? Does it lie with the Bible? Does it lie with God's expressed word through creation? Or does it lie with us, imperfect human beings, who are interpreting the Bible and interpreting science through some very, very thick cultural and limited lenses, to the point where sometimes I doubt that people can even see the page in the Bible they're reading. And with science, we're always learning new things. There's a lot to learn that we don't know. And the reason we're so certain about what I just talked about is because we've been spending 200 years kicking the tires on this thing. We're not talking about, the latest science on COVID that's being developed over a year or two. We're talking about 200 years of science. So I've never doubted my faith because of my science, but what I have doubted, as I have been attacked increasingly and now on a daily basis by people who explicitly call themselves Christians and have Bible verses in their social media profiles about loving others and about being Christ followers, and yet they attack me with words that I will not say in public here, as well as many other words like idiot and fool and all kinds of things like that. As I've been attacked on a daily basis by people who call themselves Christians, I have asked God, where are you? I believe that as believers, we've been given a new heart. That's what the Bible says. The Bible says that we are indwelled by the Holy Spirit. The Bible says that God speaks to us. And so I have definitely had moments where I've asked, God, where are you? I believe in you. I know you're with me. But why are you not more obvious in the lives of people who call themselves your followers? And I know that many at Baylor actually think about that issue. And I've been telling some of my colleagues, there was an excellent article in the Atlantic just yesterday that quoted Alan Jacob, who's here at Baylor, talking about how we need to rescue Jesus from the perception of the church in America today. About how some people who call themselves Christians on many other issues, their positions are 180 degrees from what the Bible teaches and says. And in many cases, we've confused our politics with our ideology with our faith. And rather than believing what the Bible says, our statement of faith is written first and foremost by our cultural or political identity. So I hope and I pray, and I have many people on my prayer list, that God will speak to people's hearts, that we will truly remember who we are and remember who God has made us. That we will not be like the man that James talks about who looked at himself in the mirror and then went away and forgot who he was. That we'll remember that we have a new heart, that we are being renewed by the Spirit, that we are people who should and can be recognized by one thing, which is our love for other people. That's who we are. And that we have not been given that spirit of fear, but we have been given that spirit of love and power and a sound mind. And if we as Christians could be known by that, how the world would change. There's many other good questions, but I think that's a good note to end on. So please feel free to follow me on social media. If you have some of these are really great questions, feel free to ping me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn. I've started TikTok, but I'm not super good on it yet. So if you want to give me a boost there, I'd appreciate it. Feel free to ping me, and I'm happy to answer more questions online, but I just want to leave you with that challenge. How different would the world look if we actually lived out who the Bible says we are? Thank you.
Three brief things before we part ways. Won't surprise you to hear that Dr. Hayhoe is named Christianity Today's 50 Women to Watch, Time's 100 Most Influential People, Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Global Thinkers, Politico's 50 Thinkers, Doers, and Visionaries Transforming American Politics, Fortune Magazine's World's 50 Greatest Leaders, and the United Nations Champion of the Earth, Science, and Innovation Award. We're grateful to have you with us, and you will make our list of top Laura Jackson lecturers. Thank you so much. There are a variety of delicacies, desserts here that are for you, so please don't leave tonight without enjoying the sweets and treats that are around. Take some time around the small tables if you would like. And there are, let me say finally, copies of Dr. Hayhoe's book available out in the foyer adjacent to the elevators, and she will, for a few minutes, be available to sign copies. We've had her at work for over 12 hours today, and she has one more deed to do, an international conference that she's going to make via Zoom. So if you want a copy of the book and it's signed, make your way there quickly and then come back for dessert. Dr. Hayhoe, thanks again for being here.